Maldonado, the Executive Director of the Hunt Institute for Global Competitiveness at the University of Texas El Paso. And I thank you for your attendance here today. It's truly an honor and a privilege to start a brief discussion about the critical role that our borders play on economic growth before our panel starts. So I'm going to ask you to go into the Whova app, WHOVA app, and you will find some of the slides that I'm going to go through. I don't have the slides here with me, but I'm going to go through those slides. You could also ask questions through the app, and you will find a comprehensive bio of each of the panelists. After my conversation, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. So there is no doubt that we live in a more interconnected world. But do you realize that in order to have a more globalized economy, you have to go through a port of entry? Last year, in 2022, the US had a total trade value of $5.3 trillion with the world. 50% of that trade value accounted for by 5 top trading partners. The top trading partner was Mexico last year, and the trend continues this year through July. When taking into consideration only the land ports of entry, we see that 12 ports of entry, either on the US-Canada or the US-Mexico border, 12 ports of entry, the 12 ports of entry that are at the top of the list account for 80% of the total trade value that goes through these ports of entry. But it's not only trade that goes through these ports of entry. We also have bus passengers, vehicle passengers, families, individuals that go to the other side to spend their dollars in retail, education, health, and other services. Last year, while I was attending one of the panel sessions, somebody mentioned that borders are obstacles. Objection. Yes, they could be obstacles, but we also have tremendous opportunities for economic growth. Now, why is it important to improve border efficiencies now? You'll find on one of the slides that we have an unprecedented increase in foreign direct investment from Europe, Middle East, and Asia in the United States. We also have the same phenomenon in Mexico. And since the 2020 CHIPS and Science Act, private domestic investment in manufacturing in the United States has doubled. And in fact, 35% of that investment has occurred on the southern border states. In Baja California, for example, on the Mexican side, we found that last year, 73% of foreign direct investment was accounted by Asian firms. Now, regardless of where your firm is located, if you want to be part of a globalized economy, you'll have to cross a port of entry. I would also like to mention that we recently got awarded, and when I say we, it's the Atlantic Council, Colegio de la Frontera Norte, and the Hunt Institute. We got an award from the Department of State to assess the impact of improving border efficiencies. We found that a 10-minute reduction in border wait times could lead to an increase of 532 additional commercial crossings and 5,000 non-commercial crossings per month. The economic intake would be approximately $312 million on an annual basis from commercial crossings and $5.4 million from non-commercial crossings from individuals that go to the other side and make purchases. Just as important is the fact that we found that the impact goes well beyond our ports of entry. They go into our border communities, to border states, and to non-border states as well. You will be able to find that breakdown on the handout that is on the Whova app. Now, given the resurgence of nearshoring and the growing trade activities, the role of our borders cannot be overstated. More recently, our ports of entry have witnessed unique and unquestionable challenges, and how to best address these challenges collectively is what we will precisely be discussing today with our panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce the title of each one of you, given that you have comprehensive bio on the Hoover app. So we have So we have Ruben Smith Vaughan, Director of Latin America Public Policy at Amazon. Thank you for joining us today. We have Jason Marsac, Senior Director at Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Welcome, Jason. We also have Debbie Siken, Assistant Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office of International Affairs. Thank you, Debbie. We have Carol Fowler, CEO and co-founder of Transmute. Thank you for being here. And we have Claudia Avila, General Director of Customs, Attention and International Affairs from Agencia Nacional de Aduanas de México. Bienvenida. Gracias, Claudia. So my very first question to each of the panelists will be, we're thinking about, and we have mentioned that we have to work collectively to improve border efficiencies. From your organization perspective, and given your expertise, what is your organization doing to improve border efficiencies? And what are the best practices that you would recommend similar organizations to keep improving border efficiencies? Claudia, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here to share a little bit about what we are doing at the National Customs Agency of Mexico, ANAM. Well, first of all, I think that there are two key words that we need to consider in the border efficiency. First of all is border management, and secondly, cutting-edge technology. Of course, there are other things, but we believe that one of the key success factors for a better border is the coordination of all the players. The U.S.-Mexico border is one of the most complex borders worldwide. And this means that we have to coordinate with several players, private and public sectors in both sides and in the different levels, federal, state, and local level. And it is easy to say, well, we as business people expect to have a better border, but you don't know sometimes what is backstage doing the governments on a daily basis. There are a lot of challenges that we have to face every day. Like, for instance, you saw in Juarez, the migration crisis that forced the government to close the borders, but taking care of the human rights of these migrants, but at the same time trying to work on the continuity of the business. This is a polemic because customs, in our case, we need to work on security and at the same time on compliance, tax collection, and facilitation. So these are four variables that we need to work on them together. And besides, we have our counterpart in the US, the CBP, the INL, with whom we work together on a daily basis. And in order to find out exactly what do we have to work on the bilateral agenda, we have several forums that maybe you are aware of that. And we have a lot of things to do, like, for instance, the 21st Century Border Management Initiative, where we have the group for border facilitation, where we work on having the United Cargo Processing program working 14 customs in the side of Mexico. Also, the trusted trader programs like the Authorized Economic Operator and the CityPad. And we have also this group of binational bridges and border crossing groups, where we try to have the aligned times so that the budgets and the advance of the infrastructure goes to at the same time in both sides, because sometimes Mexico finish the project, but in the US, the budget timing is different. So those are kind of the challenges that we need to work more. We also have the bicentennial framework for security, public health, and safe communities, the high-level economic dialogue, which, by the way, we had the annual session last week, where both governments expressed their worries about facilitation in terms of strengthening the regional supply chains as a factor for competitiveness. So there is a lot of work backstage. Believe me that we also want facilitation, but there are other factors that we need to consider, especially security, because as we say, the organized crime is well organized. So we as governments need to go beyond with all this coordination in a systemic way.
Thank you, Claudia. Carol?
Amazing. So like she mentioned, my name is Carol Fowler. I'm CEO and co-founder of a technology company based in Austin, Texas called Transmute. And what we're known for and what our solution does is effectively we are using emerging technology to provide one of the fastest lanes in global trade. And quite literally what we're doing is we're digitizing all the paper, EDI, PDFs involved in the documentation of moving goods across a border into something called a verifiable credential. This is just a new data format. We've actually spent the last 4+ years working with the Office of Trade at U.S. Customs and Border Protection to design it. And it's premised on an entirely open source standard. So we authored it, but it's entirely open source. So if I just take my Transmute hat off for a second, which I would love to have all of you as customers, and put on my co-chair hat at the Smart Borders group under C26 and U.S.-Mexico Foundation, as well as our customers in the government, there's really diverse interests at the border. And so when we think about as a kind of a democratic trading bloc, what our values are, what those interests are, whether that's accurate tariffs or tariff revenue, whether that's national security, or whether that's the trade that just wants to flow, we have very historically competing interests at the border and didn't previously have the tools to positively impact all those charges. So what this data model does is, in terms of impact on trade, is digitizing information this way has a similar impact to the box or the shipping container. It's a standard data format. You can use someone like Transmute who implemented it or implement it on your own. And it allows data to move in real time without losing any integrity, but also preserving things like privacy, because obviously in North America, we care about competitiveness. And so even though it sounds very complex, I think the main message I want folks to leave here with is that the technology and tools do exist to achieve that mission. And they are ready to adopt today. And there's some programs that we can kind of look to as an analog to replicate that effort in Mexico, in Canada, and other regions.
Thank you, Carol. Debbie?
Thank you. Muy buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here with esteemed colleagues. If I were to summarize what CBP is doing to help trade, I would say modernize. With all of the impressive statistics that Myra provided and increase in trade, now more than ever, it's very important for governmental agencies, and certainly I know Claudia and I share this thought, to modernize. At CBP, we are looking at modernizing our policies, our processes, our regulations, under the umbrella of the 21st century framework. We're also looking at modernizing our ports infrastructure, advanced technology insofar as non-intrusive inspection equipment. And this applies to software as well. We were just talking about ACE 2.0, which is CBP's single window system. So it's important that as governmental agencies that we help facilitate trade and make sure that we are mitigating the inherent bottlenecks that are ports of entries, in taking this multi-layered approach so that we can conduct risk management more effectively and allow legitimate goods and legitimate travel to go through. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks, Myra, and it's excellent to be on the panel with Claudia, Carol, Debbie, and of course, Ruben. Ruben, we're talking about favorite movies beforehand. We can continue that conversation later. But I think, to answer your question, a couple of things that we're doing, and I also want to acknowledge first, as we have this conversation, the incredible audience that's here too. I actually think, Myra, this could actually even be a roundtable discussion given the level of knowledge in this audience that's listening to this conversation. So I look forward to the questions later. What are a couple of things that we're doing? One is we're doing at the Atlantic Council, we're trying to show the other side of the border, right? That we're located in Washington, we can't avoid that. And Washington, the conversation about the border ends up being about the border is problems, just challenges. And what we are doing is showing that the border is no, actually, in fact, there are tons of opportunities with the border. And in order order for the U.S. to be competitive economically with the way the world is fast changing, we need to make our border work even better. And we could be a little bit maybe lackadaisical about it in yesteryears, but when we look out 5, 10, 15 years down the road and the way the world is changing, that border is going to be incredibly important for U.S. economic growth and our ability to compete in the global scale with other countries, China among them. So what are we doing? We're doing that through new analysis. Myra, you mentioned some of the data points that we put out working with you at UTEP and also working with Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana. Data points, Myra mentioned a couple, but showing the fact that the $312 million annually, just a 10-minute wait time reduction, what that could mean for the U.S., nearly 19,000 jobs in Mexico just by reducing the wait time by 10 minutes. Increased tax revenue for the border states, over $10 million in increased tax revenue for Mexico's 6 border states by doing nothing else except for reducing the wait time by 10 minutes. And also working with UTEP and Colegio de Frontera Norte, showing the fact that these benefits extend far beyond the border as well. They extend all across the U.S. and if we reimagine the way the border works, the benefits of the border can be extended far into Mexico as well. So we're doing that type of studies. We've actually done in the last year. We've been busy. We've done 2 major reports. We've done reports. One just looking at border states. One look at the U.S. and Mexico as a whole. Issue brief looking at the opportunities for improving the environment by reducing wait time. Scenario board building work looking at border 2033 and looking at 3 different scenarios of how the border action we take now the border could unfold in 2033, as well as looking specifically at the tax side, and then also taking those findings and then socialize those findings, because it's great to have studies, but I don't like to do any work at the Atlantic Council unless we're actually making sure that they're getting into the hands of decision makers that can actually elevate the findings. So I was actually very pleased that last week, Secretary Barcena, when she was speaking in her opening comments following the U.S.-Mexico high-level economic dialogue, that she used these numbers, cited our work and used these numbers. And she referenced the fact that reducing wait time by 10 minutes would bring 3,000 additional jobs to Mexico's 6 border states. And she also noted that it would facilitate the entrance of $25 million of merchandise, that's actually monthly, as we know, Myra, to the United States. And then also, I'm a country music fan, so I love Willie Nelson starting off the conversation today. But we're also going on the road. And with Jerry Schweibel and IBC Bank, we were on the road just a few weeks ago. We were in McAllen, Laredo, and San Antonio, 30 hours socializing the findings in different communities. We're looking at doing the same thing on the West Coast. But really, we've done launch events here as well, but really making sure that we're connecting border communities with the discussions that are happening in Washington, the discussions that are happening in Mexico City. And then I think last point is also bringing different communities together. And that is so important. It's one thing that I particularly like insofar as the work that we do is bringing together public sector, private sector, bringing together major multinationals. We've actually worked with Amazon on this, but also companies that are operating just at the border, the freight forwarders and other companies, to have that dialogue insofar as what needs to happen. Where's there the missing link between what's being said, in Washington, Mexico City, versus what communities in the border really need to improve those efficiencies that I said at the beginning are going to be vital for the economic success of the U.S. and for Mexico in the years ahead.
Thank you, Jason. Ruben.
Thanks, Myra, and thank you again for hosting this, and the U.S.-Mexico Foundation for organizing this panel with a great set of panelists. From Amazon, maybe I'll just give you a little bit of context on why the border matters so much to our company. When we launched 28 years ago in the garage of our CEO, when he was packing up books and sending them around the world, we were already a global company. We already had customers all over the world. But our relationship with customers here, specifically in Mexico, changed 8 years ago when we launched Amazon Mexico. And it was a different kind of launch than we've done anywhere else in the world, because we were able to leverage that interconnectivity that exists between the United States and Mexico to really directly change the way we fulfill to our customers. Today, over those last 8 years, we've already invested over 50 billion pesos in this country. We have over 8,000 employees in the country. We have over 40 buildings. Those big distribution centers that we have them from Baja California in the Northwest all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula in the Southeast. So we really can connect all 32 states and deliver to customers all over the entire country. But what's important about this network is that we don't just use this network to deliver Amazon products like the Kindle I'm using right now to take notes on. In fact, the vast majority of what we're fulfilling to customers around the world today are third-party sellers. Their products that they're selling. 60% of what's sold on Amazon today that you're hopefully purchasing on Amazon today are those third-party sellers who are selling their products. In the US alone last year, we had over $4 billion, sorry, let me get the number right, 4.1 billion products by third parties sold on Amazon's marketplace, and over 260 million of those products were exported around the world to customers, especially here in Mexico. And on the Mexico front, when we launched 8 years ago, we had very few Mexican sellers participating in e-commerce. And today, in partnership with the government, we've been able to enable over 18,000 Mexican companies to start selling on Amazon. 99% of those companies are SMBs. 40% of those companies are women-owned businesses. And most importantly, as we talk about the border, 20% of those companies are exporting. And that number is almost doubled in just the last 5 years. And so how do we enable more of those third-party sellers to be able to leverage our marketplaces to sell across the border, to bring their products from Oaxaca, right? The alebrije that's made in southern Mexico up to my house in Washington, D.C., right? That's the power that e-commerce drives, and the border plays a fundamental role in our ability to actually move those products efficiently, right? Amazon is built on this customer trust, where when you shop on Amazon, we tell you when that product's gonna get delivered to your house. And that customer demands that we bring that product, the product that they're seeking, to their house in that time. And so the ability for that product to move efficiently and effectively across that border so that third-party seller in Wichita or in Oaxaca can actually meet the demands of their consumers is vitally important. So that's why we're here. And I think what we need to do to help continue to advance this, and we had great conversations last week ahead of the HLED at the US-Mexico CEO Dialogue, it's creating that dialogue across the public and private sectors, not just in one country or another, but bringing them jointly together so that we have officials that are working on both sides of the border with both sides of the business community to come up with how do we improve that on a day-to-day basis so we can see the gains that the Atlantic Council's mentioned. And then obviously investing directly in the border itself, whether it's on the physical side of things and the digital side of things or creating safe corridors. These are things that we have to do if we really want to help enable those third parties to sell to each other's customers.
Thank you so much, Ruben. You touched on a very important point, which is working collectively. And that's my next question to you, Claudia. You know that the border is facing substantial challenges, right? From caravans to congestion. And there's also trade involved. I live on the border. I know that we have trade flows, for example, cattle trade flows. And cattle has died just because there are hours of border wait times across the border. So what is aduanas doing to alleviate these challenges for Mexican companies when they are trying to export their commodities into the United States?
Well, I think that as any other business, we have the hardware and the software. The hardware is the infrastructure, the equipment, and in this side, we are working on strengthening the infrastructure. For instance, we have 4 new projects of construction at the border crossing at Otay 2 in Tijuana, the border crossing in Agua Prieta 2, and also the Far Bridge, New Amanecer Bridge, and also Rio Bravo Dona. We are working on the construction. And then the reinforcement of 7 new projects, San Luis Rio Colorado 1, San Jerónimo, Puente 3 Comercio Mundial en Nuevo Laredo, San Jerónimo Santa Teresa, Aduanas Piedras Negras, Puente Internacional 2 Coahuila, y luego Nuevo Laredo Puente 3 y Vías Férreas de Nogales. And I know that some of you guys know this crossing border. So we are working on that in order to make it easier to have more lines and more space for the offices. And also we are investing around $970 million, equivalent of 17,500 millones de pesos, in reinforcing the 22 border customs we have in the north and also in the south with Guatemala and Belize for maintenance, new non-intrusive equipment. So these are the things that ANAM is doing on the hardware. Now, on the software, the people. I know that people think that, oh, the militaries are there in the customs. Well, yes, Sedena and the Navy Secretary are participating in ANAM, but under the umbrella of ANAM, to reinforce our capacity for security, apart from facilitation and compliance and tax collection. So we are training all these people. There are more than 1,500 people already being trained in our training in university in Querétaro and Chichimequillas, because our director, General Fulon, is very eager to have all the people in the different levels trained in order to make all the procedures easier, to reinforce to have clear procedures. And because a border is a bilateral issue, not only from one side, we are also coordinating with our counterparts, with CBP, in order to make it easier, this procedure, so everybody has the same vision, not only in the Mexican side as a general, but customs with Senacica, with COFEPRIS, with all the instances that participate in relation to security, sanitary issues, and so on. So we are doing this great effort to be more efficient.
Thank you, Claudia. And I have a question for you, Debbie. Expanding on that comment from both of you of expanding infrastructure at the ports of entry, sometimes the infrastructure is there. Is that infrastructure being underutilized? Do we have, could we expand maybe the hours of operation of these ports of entry, or maybe open more lanes that are closed at certain times, right? So what is it that we can do to leverage the current infrastructure, right? And how are decisions being made in terms of which other ports of entry should be expanded with respect to infrastructure?
So certainly we look at all of the factors that you mentioned insofar as leveraging existing infrastructure, but we balance that against the resources, and that's personnel resources that we have. Myra, as you alluded to, there are challenges right now at the border, specifically with CBP's work, because of the high volume of irregular migrant flows that, again, has required us to shift our personnel resources to address the issue, leading to closures of certain bridges. And so I think that when we talk about expanding port hours and opening up lanes or even closing them, what we are looking at is how it is that we can effectively and efficiently actually staff them and ensure that we, as a security agency, is promoting public safety and security as well as facilitating trade.
And I can attest for that extra security that we get at our border communities. Thank you for the work that you do. Now, Carol, you mentioned technology, and I think that's the beauty of that study about the 10-minute reduction in border wait times is that it could be through expansion of infrastructure, but it could also be through technology. So what are some ideas that you could impose at certain ports of entry with respect to technology, or maybe supply chains, right? It's not only at the port of entry, but also around the surrounding areas.
Yeah, maybe it's helpful to kind of play off her comments as well and just make it very concrete. Because ultimately the data model we built, I mentioned, is called verifiable credentials. It's available entirely open source. There's already well over 100 supply chain document schemas that are very specific to North America. That's where kind of us and the other companies working on this have focused. But the first market that U.S. Customs is operationalizing use of this software in is steel, and we hold the R&D contract over the last 4 years, developing the technology first for that market. And we just completed some security red team tests with Department of Homeland Security, as well as connection tests to one of the ACE 2.0 test environments. And we had real live steel companies, largely Mexican-based steel companies, logging into our product, issuing things like commercial invoices, mill test reports, which many of you may know is the certificate, or is often thought of as the origin proof for steel. And there was all the other links in the chain represented. And what we were actually testing was CBP's ability to receive that data in a structured, machine-readable way. It's literally physically linked together in real time. And the reason why we were testing that is not just for the coolness of the technology, but the base metal center on average today takes about 32 days to track down all the documents involved if they want to do a deeper investigation. Now, sometimes that doesn't mean that the goods are stalled at a port. It may mean that the goods are in our infrastructure and we're doing more of a reactive kind of after the fact recouping investigation, which is very expensive, generally public. And obviously that's an egregious stat. And we've seen that case repeated across supply chain actors, where even when companies are fairly digital, they have one aspect of their business where they're spending millions annually just basically aggregating, eliminating redundancies, reconciling it, and then taking any sort of action. And so I think one of the biggest things that we can do, in addition to just getting better data faster, so we can do more pre-arrival processing, which I think you mentioned earlier, in terms of chipping away at that 10 minutes, is actually being able to have a data set that is also machine interpretable. So we don't have the little personnel that we do have, or the less than ideal personnel that both sides has to work on this challenge. Their attention is focused on the anomalies, not the good trading actors, or on shuffling paperwork or aggregating and collating data.
Thank you so much, Carol. And my next question goes to Ruben. You were mentioning that, and it's great what Amazon is doing to leverage the already existing companies here in Mexico. Speaking about interconnectedness between Mexico and the United States, and knowing that you also have Latin America, right? What are the opportunities for Mexican firms, for Latin American firms to expand their supply chains, given the nearshoring momentum? Sometimes at the border, we have maquiladoras, we have a lot of businesses, but what else could be done so that these firms could add more added value into their firms?
I think there's two parts to that, right? I think the first one, it's worth noting that a lot of these 18,000 companies that are selling from Mexico today, it's not that these companies have long existed and joined. A lot of these companies are startups that the first way they've entered into retail is through leveraging the digital economy, the tools that, in partnership with Economia here in Mexico or with Sedecos in certain states, we've been able to help train them on how do you formalize, how do you open up a bank account for the first time, how do you get an RFC, things that you have to do to start selling on Amazon. That formalization component is something that's fundamental. But I also think it's important that, I think we talk a lot about the border and trade in these numbers, like in the billions, right? And it gets kind of too big sometimes. And it's hard to take that down to like the reality of how things actually operate on a day-to-day level, right? The idea of going to the border, as Jason recently did, and actually walking the border and seeing how it actually functions. And for us, we do that, but we do that with our customers, and our customers are our sellers, right? So we have these 18,000 companies, and how do we get more of those companies to export abroad? And to do that, we have to sit down with them. We have to make sure that they have the tools that they need to be successful, to first open up their accounts here in Mexico. And we've launched something called a unified account, so that if you're a seller in the United States, you can open up one account and already have accounts in Mexico and Canada to make it easier for you to start that North American integration that's so important. But then we also have real examples, right? So here in Mexico City, there's a company called La Comandanta, which it's two women that started their own company here in Mexico City. They source locally from farms. They've created their own salsas, and they're selling them all over Mexico, across all 32 states. And we help them through the systems that we have within Amazon to get FDA certification, to start learning how to export it. Now they are successfully selling in the US. But when we think about the border, what does that mean for their ability to actually fulfill? So, right, you have a customer in Dallas who says, I love salsa. I grew up in Mexico. I want that salsa that I used to have when I was a kid. They go on Amazon and they see La Comandanta salsa. They order it. They expect they're going to get it in 4 days, in 2 days, in 1 day.
Wow.
But when that product leaves the warehouse and starts going to that customer, if the border's shut, if there's a certain documentation issue, the customer doesn't call ANAM or CBP and say, hey, where's my product? They call Amazon, right? They call La Comandanta, and that's where the customer trust gets broken, right? And so if we want to allow small businesses like La Comandanta to be able to maintain that customer trust, we have to enable them to be able to fulfill. And on the US side, there's a company called Mr. Tortilla. There are two Mexican Americans from Los Angeles. They love cooking and they love food, and so they started their own company called Mr. Tortilla. They make these tortillas that are more organic. They're actually only 15 calories, and so they're doing incredibly well on Amazon. And obviously, given tortilla consumption here in Mexico, they started selling here in Mexico to family members and cousins. And they're doing incredibly well here as well. But when a system at the border stops working because of the software programming that works, or you have a delay of trucks, again, they lose that customer trust here in Mexico. And so it's how do we ensure that those individual SMEs that don't have lawyers and individuals working for them at the border, how do you make sure that they're able to fulfill? Because it takes one bad review, it takes one bad customer trust for those companies to stop focusing on one other country and focusing somewhere else, right? And so it behooves us to really make sure that these things work efficiently so that they can continue to create the jobs that they're creating.
Thank you so much, Ruben. And now I'm thinking about a question for you, Jason. Speaking specifically about the border, how can the U.S.-Mexico border tackle nearshoring and FDI heading its way?
Thanks, Myra. That's a great question. Also, Ruben, and now I'm going to add to my Amazon wish list La Comandanta, Mr. Tortilla, and I won't leave a bad review.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Just increase the number of stars I get. Myra, I think on the nearshoring, I think there's a couple of things. One is border efficiency, right? Making the border work better, and that's critical. But I also think I want to add a couple other dimensions to this discussion. One is, Debbie, you were talking about resources and having to move those resources from bridges to be able to deal with the surge in irregular migration. One of the points of the work that we've done is the fact that economic improvements also can bring security improvements, right? That greater economic efficiency also, this is why the work that we did was supported by INL over at State Department. So why is INL support this? Because they see the benefit, as we do as well, of the fact that security and economy, they can go hand in hand, right? And so I think I want to point that out, and also point out the fact, as I'm answering your question, Myra, as we think about nearshoring, we think about the border, this conversation has been very much focused on the border itself. Right, but I think we need to start to think about the border a little bit differently. I know some people in this room already have. I've had conversations with them about the broader border region, right? Because the border doesn't start it doesn't begin or end at a port of entry. It begins and ends, hundreds of miles potentially before that port of entry, right? And so how do we reimagine that broader border region to make nearshoring, to your question, Myra, to make nearshoring more attractive to the U.S. and Mexico? And I think a couple of things on the nearshoring front. One is some additional work that we've started on nearshoring specifically is, how do we address three specific sets of factors? How do we better align the push and the pull factors behind nearshoring, because it comes from both angles? How do we help to better align policy that's public sector policy with the business community, because it's ultimately the business community that makes decisions of where the investment happens? And then also, how do we better align short-term actions with a long-term vision, right? How do we have companies invest because of a long-term vision? And so how do we have that vision that supersedes political cycles, which is absolutely fundamental? And I think of the border itself too. It's about, and more broadly in looking at nearshoring, and some of these things have been discussed thus far at this forum, but it's about infrastructure, it's about energy, it's about human capital, it's about public-private partnerships, but it's also about expanding that collaboration between, we have U.S. and Mexican public sector officials on this panel here. So it's also about increasing that collaboration between our two countries, both at a national level, but also, as Jerry and I saw just a few weeks ago, and so well, many others who live on the border, increasing that collaboration just between the ports of entry managers, right? The port directors, on the U.S. side, on the Mexico side, a port director changes on the Mexico side. It might take a few weeks or a month or so to reestablish that relationship on the U.S. side. So how do we have more continuity in the processes between port directors on either side of the border, but then also expand that information sharing between our respective authorities at a national level?
And I agree with what you just said, Jason. I think that we have to think about not only expanding infrastructure at the ports of entry, we have to think about smart cities. There are surrounding areas, right? Mm-hmm. We have to support that those trade flows, the flows of people, the flows of commodities, and the supply chains. They go into those ports of entry, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they start right there. So, for example, there are wind blades that cross mainly the ports of entry of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez or Matamoros and Brownsville. We have to think about smart cities that support those traded commodities, again, in the city. Debbie, I have a question for you. And what strategies and best practices can governments and stakeholders implement to streamline cross-border processes and enhance efficiency. And I would also add, what could we do as a community living on the border to have our voices being echoed, right? Thank you.
So before diving into that, I just want to sort of reflect on what Jason said in terms of economic security being as important. Wholeheartedly agree. And I believe both governments, the United States and Mexico, have made investments, not just in our people, but also in other countries to promote that economic security and to stem the root causes of irregular migration. Those are longer term issues, and the results of economic security, or on the flip side, insecurity, plays out in longer term. What we are faced right now on the border is the immediate humanitarian needs that we have to tend to, and immediate threats there may be if we don't if we're not able to secure our border. So there are long-term, short-term interests and incentives that we have to balance, certainly from a governmental perspective, as well as, I believe, from the business communities. How do we, what are some of the best practices? Well, I think we've touched on a lot of that today. Communication. I think, I started it with the need for modernization. Well, we're not going to do it right if we're not talking to our governmental partners or to trade stakeholders. And we're seeing more and more of that. This is the second time I've seen Ruben in a week.
And it's been wonderful.
Yes, fantastic. But we're doing more of that, and certainly as CBP, we have standardized processes to engage with our trade stakeholders. And in the last year, we've invited and brought in the CEO dialogue to participate, and very much looking forward to expanding that through partnership that certainly CBP and ANAM has together. I think that through these conversations and dialogue, we can find ways to harmonize policies, processes, regulation. We can look at the ways that we collect information to try to eliminate burdensome paperwork that Carol was alluding to in her response. But perhaps one of the most obvious best practices that we enjoy is through our trusted trader programs. With Mexico, it's the OEA program, and for CBP, it's CTPAT, where we're constantly being able to balance security interests through those programs while providing facilitation benefits to our trade partners. And I believe that if we continue this dialogue together, that we can further improve and make sure that our programs are as widely applicable and provide as much benefit as possible to trade stakeholders.
Thank you so much for your answer. Carol, well, before I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then I'm going to go into the Whova app for questions from the audience. So please log into your profile and ask questions. Carol, how can secure and faster border inspections reduce costs, and how does technology play a role there?
So I'm going to take that question and also feed off of your response as well, because just kind of putting a finer point on the conversations and the dialogues that need to happen across the public-private sector. The part of U.S. Customs and DHS that we're contracted with is a program called the Silicon Valley Innovation Program, and they're actually mandated to only do business with companies who can prove that they are dual use and commercially viable. And so they tend to fund solving very interesting problems. And in the case of trade, going back to all the diverse interests at a border within a supply chain, you have a case where no one is going to want to adopt the new data technology or the new tool if it doesn't do them any good. It can't only do one player in the supply chain or benefit only one player. And so I think in addition to just the digitization piece and being able to get better data earlier in the process, one thing or benefit that I haven't talked a lot about with regards to this data format is it lets you also take a much more real-time response or interaction with the data. And so when you're thinking about our trusted trader programs, and you have, especially the US and Mexico is a very unique kind of the fast lane program, and some of these cases where you actually need every link in the chain to be certified in order to get the top tier benefits. But what happens when your truck driver is sick and you need to contract someone more in real time? Instead of stalling everyone, why don't we have a system where you can note that in real time and the administration of those benefits can be taken care of digitally and in real time? It's those kinds of cases that this data format supports really effectively. And I'll also note that while Transmute is very focused on deploying this solution in trade and only trade, there are companies who are using these same open standards, some who are working with US Customs today and USCIS on deploying these technologies for individual credentials. So the same data format can be used to work on some of our immigration flows as well.
That's very insightful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I didn't think about, hey, not everybody would like to adopt those technologies, right? And how you're coping with that. That's amazing. Claudia, my last question. There are measures that are impacting trade. There are non-tariff measures. There are events that are happening. How are you coordinating those efforts with other customs from other countries to facilitate trade for Mexican firms?
Well, I think that the key issue is risk mitigation. As I said, the organized crime is well organized, and we have to go beyond of what these organizations do in the illegal trafficking of merchandise and drugs, and now with the fentanyl, which is easier to transport, we have more challenges in order to combat this illegal traffic. So what we do is any custom agency has customs agreements with other countries. In the case of Mexico, we have 23 agreements and another 26 in process. And these agreements, what they do is to have the institutional framework for the interchange of alerts, and also to interchange best practices and interchange of information, because that the information is very sensitive in customs because it implies privacy and security. So we cannot interchange just because you are my friend. We need to have cybersecurity issues, protocols. So we have these agreements so that when, for instance, a container from an Asian country is coming to Mexico with the suspect of drugs, then when it arrives to the port, we have the alert, and then we have all the capacity with the police and everything to intercept these containers. So we are working a lot on risk mitigation, and we are inviting companies, private sector, to help us in mitigating the risk, because if both sides work on risk mitigation, then we can work also on facilitation. You know that these trusted programs like the authorized economic operator and CityPad, they were created precisely to care about the global chain security. But we have found out that some certified companies have contaminated containers. So we need to care. We all are responsible of security. So if we mitigate risk, then the probability of facilitation is higher. So that's what we are doing in these cases.
Thank you so much, Claudia. So I'm going to take questions from the audience. Thank you, Julia.
We've had a number of questions come in, but a couple of them. So starting off, if there was one regulation or law that would help standardize the processes,
to harmonize the processes. Well, actually, we are working as a part of the 21st century initiative to harmonize the manifestos, the customs manifestos on all the transportation means, air transportation, land and railway, and maritime. So if we have one document for both countries, that will be easier, no? Instead of having one paper for the Mexican side and another for the US side. So only one manifesto. This will help to make more agile the crossing border, the border crossing.
Does anyone else want to check in on that one?
I'd say I'm watching the Customs Mod Act very closely, the two titles, the one on enforcement, but the other on facilitation, I think is really fascinating because that's where the dialogue with commercial trade is even more important. Understanding what is facilitation to the varying sizes and commodities supported in the supply chain, I think is interesting. And then on the US side, we have one of the highest de minimis in the world. It's caused a lot of awesome things and a lot of not so awesome things. And so there's some new legislation there that I think looks very similar to this kind of dynamic benefits administration situation we were talking about with trusted trader programs.
I guess along the same lines of what Claudia and Carol said, I would just, expand that a little bit. I would seek the authority to be able to freely exchange information, actually, government to government. Oftentimes we are bound by many laws that do not allow us to share necessary information so that we can do joint inspections very easily, share images, share manifest information, all of which goes to reduce wait times. So that's something that I would look for.
So Debbie, I mean, that's something that I've heard a lot too, is the importance of sharing information, right? Sharing information so far as knowing, being able to know, what's the suspect cargo versus what's the non-suspect cargo, right? And we spend a lot of time, looking, analyze the border cargo that really is legitimately passed through, but there isn't that, that kind of level of information sharing between the United States and Mexico. It's not, and it's at the border, but it's also kind of before you get to the border as well. And that is so important. Again, as we think about the broader border region, where are things potentially coming through the border that could be a threat, and being able to know that in advance, working closely with our counterparts on either side of the border would have pay incredible dividends.
There were a couple of questions on staffing, so I'm going to sort of combine the two. But considering advancements in technology, it seems that ports of entry are still reliant on human capital for staffing. So what sort of shifts can we see in terms of staffing at ports of entry? And is there potential that staffing will increase?
Well,
or
at the
as a
Mexican,
result of technology?
yeah, as I said before, at the ANAM, we are working on a program to reinforce the non-intrusive equipment at all the customs agency on a national wide. But technology is not enough. We need the people, and the trained people that knows how to deal with this equipment, but also the maintenance and the updating of the software. There are a lot of things. It's not only that, we need more non-intrusive equipment. There are a lot of things involved in the using of technology. And as Debbie said, the interchange with our counterparts of information is also very important to be more efficient in terms of technology. But information interchange implies also cybersecurity, reciprocity, and also privacy of information. So these are the challenges that we are facing in order to make technology be useful for having a more efficient borders.
So I'll take that question as well. I think ultimately, whether we can expect to have more officers, I'll leave that to Congress to decide. I'm just happy we have a budget that allows me to be here today. So look, what we're doing is utilizing technology and leveraging that to really facilitate the low risk items, right? What we want is to focus our officers on what they do best, which is to inspect and use their abilities, their experience, and focus on the high risk items. So we don't foresee technology replacing the need for our officers. We do want to ensure that we are training our officers effectively to utilize the new technology and also to focus them on other inspections techniques that they can now be freed to focus on.
Thank you so much for your presence, for your attendance here. We are closing this panel. I would like to mention that I hope it's clear how important are borders for economic growth, and that let us be reminded that next time when we're on the road again, we have to cross our port of entry. So let's invest in our borders, in our ports of entry, and in all the supply chains that supplement that economic growth. Thank you for the amazing work that you do. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.